The wind outside roared like a beast, carrying masses of snow that buried everything in sight. I had just settled into my favorite armchair, enjoying the warmth of the fire, when I heard a faint scratching at the door. At first I ignored it, thinking the wind was just playing tricks on me, but then came a sound that froze me in place, a desperate whimper. I opened the door and found a trembling German shepherd, its body covered in snow, barely clinging to life. What happened next will haunt me forever. The winter in the mountains is a force to be reckoned with, and the blizzard that night was no ordinary storm. It was one of those relentless, unforgiving storms that made you thankful to be indoors. My cabin, hidden in the forest, was my refuge, and I had spent the evening doing what I always did on nights like this, tending to the fire and letting its warmth drive the cold out of my bones. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle and the shutters creak. I was halfway through a book, the kind you read slowly just to enjoy it, when I heard it, a faint, repetitive, scratching sound. At first I ignored it. Sounds like that were nothing unusual around here. Branches swaying in the wind, animals wandering through the snow, and sometimes it seemed like the cabin itself groaned under the weight of the snow. But then the sound came again, more insistent this time. Scratch, scratch, whine. I put my book down, my heart starting to race. When you live alone in the wilderness, you learn to trust your instincts, and something about that sound didn't sit right. I cautiously approached the door, pressing my bare feet against the cold wooden floor. The scratching stopped as I drew near, replaced by a soft, pitiful whimper. My pulse quickened. What could it be? A wounded animal? I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and cracked the door open. The icy wind hit me immediately, sending a cloud of snow into the cabin. I shined the beam of light onto the porch, and my breath caught in my throat. There stood a German shepherd, its fur covered in frost, its body shaking violently. Its ribs were visible under its matted fur, and its eyes, oh, its eyes, were filled with a mixture of fear and despair. Jesus Christ, I whispered, opening the door wider. The dog tried to move forward but stumbled, its legs giving way beneath it. Without thinking, I dropped the flashlight, reached out, and lifted it into my arms. Its body was ice cold, its fur damp and rough against my skin. Hang in there, buddy, I murmured, carrying him inside before closing the door behind us. I gently laid him on the rug by the fire, my hands trembling as I grabbed a blanket to wrap him in. He didn't move, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a moment, I thought I was too late. Stay with me, I urged in a broken voice, rushing to the kitchen to fill a bowl with lukewarm water and grab an old towel. Then I knelt beside him and began gently rubbing his fur to melt the ice and bring warmth back into his frozen body. His ears twitched slightly, a small sign of life that filled me with hope. As I worked, questions swirled in my mind. Where had he come from? How long had he been out there in the storm? And why had he chosen my cabin? The storm raged on outside, but inside the fire crackled and the room grew warmer. The dog's shaking lessened, his eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting mine before closing again. You're safe now, I whispered. I wasn't sure if he could hear me, but as I sat there, watching over him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an ordinary moment. This encounter, this dog, had come to me for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was only the beginning. The fire crackled softly as I sat beside the German shepherd, watching his chest rise and fall in shallow but steady breaths. The room was silent, save for the storm raging outside. The wind howled, restless as a spirit. I wrapped another blanket around him, trying to suppress the gnawing fear that he wouldn't make it through the night. Every few minutes, I reached out to check if his body was warming up. His fur started to lose its icy stiffness, and the shivering eased. I continued gently massaging his paws, trying to restore circulation. His ears twitched slightly, and his tail moved just a bit. These small signs of life felt like monumental victories. Where are you from, buddy? I asked softly, more to myself than to him. His matted fur and emaciated body suggested he had been alone for a long time, but he had made it through a storm that could have easily taken his life, all the way to my door. It wasn't luck, but sheer determination. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The snow piled up against the windows, and the wind continued to lash against the cabin. I had nowhere to go, no one to call. Life off the grid had its perks, peace and solitude, but in moments like this, I was on my own. I went into the kitchen and warmed up some chicken broth, the simplest thing I could think of to tempt him to eat. When I returned, his eyes were slightly open. They were a deep, soulful brown, fixed on mine. I knelt beside him. "Hey," I said softly, placing the bowl of broth in front of his nose. "I made this for you. Can you try a little?" He sniffed weakly at the bowl, his nose twitching. After a moment, he stretched his neck forward and licked at the liquid. My chest tightened with relief. "Good boy," I whispered, gently petting his head. The simple act of eating seemed to give him a little strength. He tried to shift his position, lifting himself slightly before sinking back onto the blanket. "Take it easy," I said quietly, helping him relax again. "You've been through a lot. Take it slow." As the hours passed, he seemed to stabilize. His breathing deepened and his eyes stayed open longer. He followed me with his gaze as I moved around the room. I could tell he was still wary. He didn't know where he was or if he was truly safe. I began to think about his story. Had he been abandoned? The scars on his body spoke of a life full of hardship, but there was no collar, no tag, nothing to link him to a previous life. As the storm subsided, the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The dog was sleeping again, his head resting on the folded blanket I had given him. He looked peaceful now, his body relaxed in a way that suggested he hadn't felt safe in a long time. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat in my armchair, and stared at the sleeping dog. There was something about him that felt significant, like he had entered my life for a reason I didn't yet understand. As the morning light grew stronger, I decided I couldn't just leave him to fend for himself. This dog couldn't go back to the wilderness. He needed care, a home, someone to help him heal. And deep down, I knew I needed him as much as he needed me. But just as I sipped my coffee, a faint scratching sound broke the silence. My eyes shifted to the door. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination. But then it came again. Scratch, scratch. I froze, my mind racing. Was someone or something out there? The dog stirred, his ears pricking up at the sound. I took a deep breath, went to the door and opened it cautiously. What I saw made my stomach drop. The cold wind hit me like a slap as I opened the door, and my heart pounded in my chest. I almost expected another animal or, worse, something inexplicable. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim morning light, I saw nothing at first. It's just the fresh snow covering the yard and the dark outline of the forest in the distance. "Hello," I called out with a trembling voice. The scratching came again, this time from below. I looked down and froze. Another German shepherd stood directly in front of the door. It was smaller and younger, its fur just as matted and frozen as that of the one already inside. "Oh my God," I murmured as I crouched down. The young dog took a hesitant step forward, its paws trembling from the cold. It didn't bark, growl, or back away. Instead, it gave me the same desperate look I had seen the night before. A silent cry for help. "Where are you from?" I whispered. My first instinct was to let it inside, but something felt off. Two dogs, both in poor condition, appeared in the middle of a brutal snowstorm at my door. This couldn't be a coincidence. My eyes wandered to the forest, scanning the tree line for signs of movement. Was someone out there? Had these dogs been abandoned nearby? The younger dog whimpered quietly, snapping me out of my thoughts. "All right, come on," I said, and opened the door wider. "Let's get you warmed up." The cold rushed in like an unwelcome guest as I pulled the dog inside. The older German shepherd, still by the fire, perked up slightly, its ears twitching as it sniffed the air. The younger dog cautiously approached it. There was a moment of recognition. The older dog raised its head and wagged its tail weakly. "You know each other," I said aloud, realization dawning on me. The younger dog curled up beside the older one, resting its head on the older dog's side, as if seeking comfort. The scene touched my heart. I couldn't explain it. These weren't just two stray dogs. This was family. I grabbed another blanket, draped it over the two of them, and sat down beside them. My mind raced. Where had they come from? Had they been brought here to safety? The scars on the older dog's body suggested a life full of hardship. The younger dog had no visible injuries but was smaller, thinner, and clearly weaker. Yet its eyes still sparkled with life. I fed the younger dog the rest of the broth and watched as it eagerly gulped it down. The older German Shepherd gently leaned against the pup, a gesture that spoke volumes. They had been through something together, something that had brought them to my doorstep. As the sun rose higher and the snowstorm finally subsided, I could see the forest more clearly. The trees stood tall like sentinels. The weight of the situation hit me suddenly. These dogs hadn't just stumbled into my cabin by chance. They had come for a reason. The question was, what had brought them here? I decided to get to the bottom of it. After making sure the dogs were warm and comfortable, I grabbed my coat and boots. The wind had died down, but the air was still bitterly cold as I stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I walked around the cabin looking for tracks. It didn't take long to find them. Two paw prints leading from the woods to my porch, partially covered by fresh snow. But what made my stomach turn was the third set of tracks, larger, deeper, and unmistakably human. I stared at the tracks, my mind racing. Someone had been out here with these dogs and had left them behind. But why? I followed the tracks toward the forest, a feeling of unease creeping over me. Whatever had brought these dogs to my door, it wasn't over yet. The sight of the human footprints sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The snowstorm had passed, and the forest lay in eerie, untouched silence. The paw prints and footprints were partially covered by fresh snow, but still clear enough to follow. I pulled my coat tighter around me, adjusted my scarf, and took a deep breath. My breath fogged in the freezing air as I took my first step into the woods. I looked back at the cabin. The two German shepherds lay by the fire. The younger one had curled protectively against the older dog. Part of me wanted to stay with them, focus on their recovery, but the tracks leading into the woods suggested someone had been out there with them, and I needed to know why or if they were still in danger. The forest grew denser, and the snow crunched loudly beneath my boots as I ventured deeper among the trees. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The creaking of branches above me, the occasional slide of snow falling from high branches. My nerves were on edge, but I kept following the trail. The human footprints were erratic, winding between the paw prints as if the person, whoever they were, had wandered aimlessly. The tracks would often pause for a moment before continuing. After about 20 minutes, I reached a small clearing, and the tracks abruptly stopped. The snow was disturbed, as though there had been a struggle. My heart raced as I scanned the area, taking in every detail. There were scratch marks in the snow, paw prints circling a depression in the snow where the human footprints had ended. "What happened here?" I muttered aloud. I crouched down and ran my gloved hand over the packed snow. It was tightly packed, as though someone had fallen or been pushed to the ground. A chill ran down my spine. It was unsettling, like the aftermath of a fight, but there was no blood, no sign of injury. As I stood, I noticed something half buried in the snow. It was a leash, its ends frayed as though it had been chewed through. My mind was flooded with questions. Had the dogs been tied up here? Had they broken free? I looked around again, my eyes scanning the tree line. The forest seemed to close in around me, its silence oppressive. Whoever had been here was long gone, but the leash told me one thing. These dogs hadn't come to my cabin by accident. A sudden crack, the snap of a branch behind me, made me whirl around. My heart pounded in my chest. For a moment, I saw nothing but the endless expanse of trees, but then I caught a movement in the shadows. "Hello," I called, my voice steady despite the fear tightening my chest. The figure emerging from the trees was not a person. It was the older German shepherd, its golden brown fur stark against the snow. Its tail wagged lightly as it approached, and its eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that took my breath away. "You followed me," I said, and relief washed over me. The shepherd stopped a few meters away, its ears twitching as if listening for something. Then it barked sharply, urgently, its voice echoing through the clearing. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, stepping toward him. He barked again, turning his head toward the deeper part of the woods. It was as if he was trying to tell me something, urging me to follow him. My hesitation lasted only a moment before I decided to follow him. My fear was replaced by a growing sense of purpose. Whatever had brought these dogs into my life, it wasn't over. As I followed the shepherd deeper into the forest, I knew I was about to uncover a truth I wasn't prepared for. The German shepherd moved with purpose, its paws crunching in the snow as it led me further into the woods. Every few steps it glanced back at me, its eyes filled with a sense of urgency that twisted my gut. Wherever it was leading me, it was important, and probably nothing I wanted to face. The forest grew thicker, the trees forming a canopy that blocked out the little sunlight filtering through the clouds. The air felt colder and heavier here, and the silence was oppressive. My breath formed invisible clouds as I struggled to keep pace with the dog. Despite the torments it had endured, it seemed tireless. "Where are you taking me, boy?" I murmured softly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. Of course, it didn't answer, but its pace quickened. We weaved through the trees, following no visible path, until we reached a small clearing. In the center of it stood a dilapidated shed, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. Its sight made my heart sink. A shiver ran down my spine. The German shepherd stopped a few meters in front of the shed, barking. His tail wagged slightly and he looked at me expectantly, as if urging me to come closer. I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. Why had he brought me here? Was someone inside? Had the dogs been kept here before they escaped? I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The snow crunched loudly under my boots. The closer I got to the shed, the stronger the feeling of unease grew. The wood was weathered and rotting, the windows covered in dirt. I placed my hand on the door handle, the cold metal seeping into my skin as I turned it. The door creaked loudly, and the sound echoed in the stillness of the forest. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something else. Something metallic. My eyes adjusted to the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the walls, and what I saw made my heart stop. There were cages, 4 of them, lined up against the opposite wall. They were now empty, but the remains of what had been inside were unmistakable. Matted fur, chewed-up blankets, and broken bowls scattered across the floor. This wasn't just a shed, it had been a prison. I turned to look at the shepherd, who was standing right behind the door. His tail was lowered, his ears flat against his head, and he let out a quiet whimper. My chest tightened. This was where he and the younger dog had come from. I stepped closer to the cages, my hands trembling as I inspected them. The metal bars were bent in places, the locks rusted and broken. It was clear that the dogs had escaped, but not without a fight. My mind was filled with images of what they must have gone through here. Cold nights, no food, and the fear of the one who had brought them to this place. Who had done this and why? As I turned to leave, I noticed something on a makeshift table near the wall, a small notebook. I picked it up. The leather cover was cracked and stiff with age. I opened it and skimmed through the entries. My stomach twisted with every line I read. It was a logbook, dates, descriptions, and details about the dogs. Most entries were brief, but one stood out. Subject number 12, male German shepherd, strong, obedient, potential for resale, high resale value. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. These dogs hadn't just been abandoned, they were part of something much worse. I closed the notebook, my hands clenched in anger. Whoever had done this hadn't just tortured these animals, they had exploited them, treated them like commodities, not living beings. The shepherd barked again, pulling me out of my thoughts. He was standing by the door, his body tense, his eyes fixed on something. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice shaking. I followed his gaze, and yes, there it was. A figure, dark and shadowy, was standing there watching us. The German shepherd stood at the door, his body stiff, his tail lowered, and his gaze fixed on the shadowy figure. He barked a sharp warning that echoed through the forest. I took a shaky step forward, shielding my eyes from the bright snow, trying to make out more details. The figure began to move slowly and deliberately toward us. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. The crunching of boots in the snow grew louder as the person got closer. Their face remained hidden in the shadow of a hood. My grip on the notebook tightened as I prepared for whatever was about to happen. Then the shepherd did something that surprised me. He stepped in front of me and positioned himself like a shield. His body was tense and ready. His loyalty was palpable in that moment, giving me the courage to stand firm. As the figure entered the clearing, they pulled back their hood, revealing a man who appeared to be in his late 40s. His face was weathered and hard, his eyes flicking between me and the dog, narrowing when they landed on the notebook in my hand. "That's not yours, Hashhaman," he said in a low, threatening voice. I looked down at the notebook, and my anger flared. "These dogs don't belong to you," I shot back. The man grinned, but his eyes betrayed a hint of discomfort. "You don't know what you're talking about. Leave that here, and no one gets hurt." The shepherd growled low in his throat and stepped closer to the man, his presence a warning, a silent promise that he wouldn't let anyone get near me. "What have you done to them?" I demanded, holding the notebook up. "Why were they in these cages? What about the scars on his body?" The man's grin faded. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," he said coldly. "These dogs were property, more than property." The word came out of his mouth like poison. "They're living being," I countered. "They have more loyalty and heart than you'll ever have." The man took a step closer, but before he could say anything, the shepherd lunged forward, barking wildly. The man stumbled back, obviously unprepared for the dog's ferocity. "That's enough!" he shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. I took advantage of the moment. "You will pay for what you've done," I said firmly. The man's eyes darted to the woods as if calculating his escape. Without another word, he turned and ran, disappearing between the trees. The shepherd chased him a few steps before stopping. His ears were up, his tail still stiff. I dropped to my knees and wrapped my arms around the dog's neck. "Good boy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're amazing." He licked my face and his tail wagged for the first time since I'd found him. I knew the man would likely return, but for now I had what I needed. The notebook, the evidence of his crimes, and the German shepherd by my side. A loyal companion who had been through hell and still had the courage to protect someone he barely knew. Back at the cabin, I called the authorities and reported everything I had found. It didn't take long before officers arrived. They took my statement and the notebook, promising to follow up on the matter. But even as they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The shepherd and the younger dog stayed with me. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. I named the older one Hero because that's exactly what he was. A hero who had survived against all odds and stood by my side when it mattered most. As for the man in the woods, I never saw him again. But the scars he had left on these dogs and the determination they showed to survive will stay with me forever. The story of Hero is a reminder of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. His courage and loyalty changed my life forever, and I'm sure there are countless other stories like his waiting to be told. Dogs like Hero deserve love, care, and a chance at a better life, just as he found with me. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks to our valued viewers, we continue to improve every day. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up.